Well, in our exposition of the book of Titus, we come this evening to a section of chapter 1 dealing with false teachers. False teachers. It's an uncomfortable subject, but it's a subject that's necessary. It's a subject that's important because we face false teachers in the church. We have faced false teachers in our congregation in the past, people who have come within the orbit of the congregation. We have some of that even occasionally at the present, and we'll continue to face these sorts of things in the future. And so, for instance, as you will likely know, there are men who were kind of within our circles and within our broader orbit who confessed a true Reformed orthodoxy, very much what we would hold, who are now purveyors of a kind of divine right white supremacy doctrine and are rabidly obsessed with that doctrine and are pushing it. I won't name their names. You know who they are. I don't want to give them any press. There are others who have come within our circle and have come and visited at our congregation who have been purveyors of a false doctrine of marriage permanence, where they teach that there are no lawful grounds for divorce. And as minor as that may seem in terms of someone's private opinion, we're talking about people who are obsessed with this doctrine and who try to convince people of the doctrine and try to undermine the authority of the church, try to undermine the church's confession, and try to lead people astray after themselves and their own doctrines. And so you see that it is important that we handle this subject of false teachers, that we see the characteristics of false teachers, and that we know how to respond when we are confronted with false teachers. And so the section which we're dealing with this evening is verses 10 through 13 of chapter 1 here. We've covered a little bit of this in the last sermon, but we'll cover a little bit of the same ground again. So verse 10, we see, "For there are many unruly and vain talkers and deceivers, especially they of the circumcision." This is why Paul tells Titus they need elders in Crete. He says that the elders need to be able by sound doctrine both to exhort and convince the gainsayers, for there are many unruly and vain talkers and deceivers, especially they of the circumcision. And so we begin to consider in verse 10 through verse 12 the characteristics of a false teacher. First, we read that they are unruly. Unruly, that is to say, they're insubordinate. They don't listen to church authority. They won't submit to church authority. They're not interested in church authority. They're puffed up with their own ideas, with their own conceits, and they will not listen to counsel. That makes them, by the way, by definition, fools. But they are fools who are intruding themselves within the vineyard of the Lord and trying to lead people astray. And they're insubordinate to all authority. They will not listen to anybody. They're resistant to anyone who would try to hold them in check. Many unruly and vain talkers and deceivers. Vain talkers, as we talked about last time, it's one word in the Greek. Vain talkers. The idea is simply that they speak empty words. Empty words. They may have a lot of words. They may love to talk. Usually these people will. They'll love to gather people to themselves and to talk, and they sound so confident and so self-assured in their doctrine, but there's no substance to it. there's no substance to it. There were, in the days of the New Testament, as well as before those times, certain teachers of rhetoric and fallacious orators called the sophists. And this is what they were all about. They could spin a yarn, they could make a great speech, be very impressive, draw people to themselves, but ultimately there was no substance to their words. In fact, they made it their trade to come up with any kind of persuasive argument they could to refute any opinion anyone brought to them. And their argument may be a long list of fallacies, but if they could say it persuasively enough, they could win the debate. And that's the way false teachers are. They're vain talkers. They may be very impressive talkers, but their speech is vanity. It's empty. They think they know what they're talking about, but they don't. They're like those, as we've seen in 1 Timothy chapter 1, who, desiring to be teachers of the law, understanding neither what they say nor whereof they affirm. Vain talkers. He calls them also deceivers. Deceivers. They're cunning and they're smooth in their speech. They are like the father of lies, who disguises himself as an angel of light. And they can come alongside and they can seem very sincere, but they're deceivers. Their words and their arguments may seem plausible. One thing they will love to do is they'll bring out arguments and categories that their hearers aren't familiar with. They'll kind of overawe their hearers with doctrines that are new to them and exciting to them. And they set themselves up as though they are experts in something that all these other people don't understand. And so they overawe people with their rhetoric. They're deceivers. He says that it's especially they of the circumcision. That is, these are Jewish teachers. Jewish teachers. There were a large number of Jews in Crete where Titus was ministering. And so within the church there, it would have been a church like most of the New Testament churches, composed of both Jews and Gentiles together. But among the Jewish believers, there were those who taught the false doctrine of the Judaizers. The Judaizers. Understanding the Judaizers is important for understanding a large portion of the New Testament, especially the epistles of the Apostle Paul. The Judaizers taught a twofold legalism. A twofold legalism. The first part of their legalism is that they taught that the Gentiles had to keep the ceremonies of the Mosaic law. That the Gentiles needed to be circumcised, that they needed to keep the food laws, that they needed to keep the feast days, all of these sorts of things. You see it coming up again and again all through the New Testament. So they taught this twofold legalism. First, they taught that the Gentiles had to keep the ceremonies of the Mosaic law. But the second part of their legalism is that they taught that law-keeping was a condition of being accepted with God. That law-keeping was a condition of being accepted with God. And for them, in particular, they taught that keeping the ceremonial law was necessary in order to be accepted with God. So this was their twofold legalism. Sometimes we use the word legalism to describe those who add to the law of God, those who impose laws of their own, commandments of men. And they did that insofar as they were imposing the Mosaic ceremonial law upon the Gentiles. But then we also use the term legalism to describe those who teach justification by works, justification by the works of the law. They combined those two things together. That's the error of the Judaizers. Works righteousness through keeping the ceremonial law. So, now these Jewish teachers would overawe their Gentile hearers with their seeming expertise in the law of Moses. As we said, false teachers love to overawe their listeners with their pretended expertise in the thing that their listeners are relatively ignorant about. And so the Gentile hearers who wouldn't have grown up with the law of Moses, didn't know the ceremonial law, would listen to these Jewish teachers who would unfold all the intricacies of the law of Moses and teach the Gentiles that they had to keep these things as well. And so that's how they managed to overthrow their faith. Now we have modern Judaizers in our day as well. We have people in our day who teach a doctrine that's very much the same. They teach that as Christians we ought to be keeping the law of Moses. That as Christians we need to be observing circumcision, food laws, the feast days of the Mosaic law. And they try to impose these things. And these modern Judaizers take advantage of the ignorance of professing Christians, especially Zionist-type professing Christians and so on, who are already obsessed with Israel. And they take these things and they scratch the ears of these people who are eager to learn about all of these details about the Mosaic law, and they bring them under their sway. False teachers, modern-day Judaizers. Is it possible we can get some chairs set up? We've got some more people who have come in. And so they mystify, as it were, the Gentile hearers with their doctrines of the Mosaic law. Now, in our day, the church is being assailed by Kenism. And Kenists do something very similar to this, not with the Mosaic law, but with natural law. With natural law. And so there's a true doctrine of natural law, and it's something that in our modern day, we have lost the whole concept of natural law. It's being recovered, thanks be to God, but in the midst of its recovery, you have men who have risen up and they're twisting it. And they're claiming that natural law teaches things that it doesn't actually teach. And so I do not recommend you going and listening to these Kenist false teachers and so on. But if you ever have heard anything they have to say, they'll focus on natural law arguments for their doctrine of Kenism. And in doing so, they're taking advantage of the relative ignorance of natural law that's out there in order to push their doctrine within the Trojan horse of natural law. That's what they're really doing. It's the same thing the Judaizers were doing by teaching their doctrine of works righteousness and sneaking it in with the Trojan horse of the Mosaic law. This is what false teachers do. Verse 11, whose mouths must be stopped, who subvert whole houses, teaching things they ought not, for filthy lucre's sake. They subvert whole houses, teaching things they ought not. We read in 2 Timothy chapter 3 of these kinds of false teachers that they creep into houses. They creep into houses. If they can isolate families within the church, if they can isolate families by visiting them in their homes and teaching them, then they can undermine and overthrow their faith. If they can get them away by themselves and get an audience with them and butter them up and win them over. And, Paul talks about these false teachers, these very Judaizers. He talks about them zealously courting the people of God. Zealously courting them. Go into their homes. Let's have a private Bible study. That sort of thing. Sheep are only safe in flocks, guarded by a shepherd. But if a predator can isolate a sheep, it's easy prey. That's what these false teachers do. They try to get people away from the church. If they can't, and it begins with creeping into houses, even perhaps while they're still attending church and so on. You start small with going and visiting them at their home and so forth, and start to bring in your false doctrine, little by little, until the false teacher has gained their confidence more than the leadership of the church, and they've undermined the leadership of the church. And then they have them in their grasp, and they can separate them from the flock of God altogether and lead them after themselves. Now, these things are a special danger, actually, in our digital age. Because the false teachers that like to creep into houses, they're already in your house. They're already in your house. If you simply bring them up on the internet, they're already in your house. They don't even have to do the work of coming after you individually. Now, they may do that, but they've already put their stuff out there on the internet so that people are just gobbling this stuff up at home. And it's undermining their confidence in the leadership of their churches. It's undermining their faith. And they're being led astray after false teachers who subvert whole houses, teaching things which they ought not, for filthy lucre's sake. For filthy lucre's sake. When it says for filthy lucre's sake, it's literally for the sake of disgraceful gain. For the sake of disgraceful gain. And the word translated gain, if we just look at our version here where it says for filthy lucre's sake, we think, well, it's talking about money. But the word that's literally gain here is a word that means gain in the broadest sense. It means more than just money. It can mean money, but it means monetary gain, social gain, spiritual gain. It's used in a positive way as well. But it means more than money. But all false teachers are in it for personal gain of one sort or another. Whether it's monetary gain, whether it's their own pride and feeding into their own pride, whether they fantasize about having a following, and that's really all they're after, is to have a group of people that follow them and that are their little kingdom, as it were, and they're over it all. All false teachers are in it for personal gain of one sort or another, whether it's to line their pockets or whether it's to feed their pride. They may even suffer much hardship if it serves their purpose. And so just because somebody has been seriously disadvantaged by their false teaching doesn't mean that this doesn't apply to them, that they're in it for dishonorable gain. They may not be in it for the money. They may have lost their money because of it, and yet they're getting what they're really after. Money may not be the thing they're after. The early Mormons went through a lot in terms of the loss of things in this world. They lost a lot more eternally. But their leaders had a devoted, slavishly devoted following that followed them across the entire continent into a wilderness, serving them. They got what they were after. And so they're always after something for personal gain. They're not self-effacing. They're not in it for the Lord's glory. They're not doing it for the good of the church. They'll wreak havoc of the church. They'll steal the Lord's glory because they're in it for personal gain. They're in it for themselves. Well, in verse 12, we have the character of a Cretan. The character of a Cretan. He says, one of themselves, even a prophet of their own, said, the Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, slow bellies. Who is this prophet he's talking about? He's certainly not a biblical prophet. He was a man named Epimenides, who was a kind of insane prophet, poet of Crete in ancient days, about 500 years before the New Testament was written. And so this man was not at all a contemporary with the Apostle Paul. He was somebody who was held in high honor by the people of Crete. I've very often heard people describe this man as a philosopher, Epimenides, as a philosopher. You look into him, he's not like a Socrates-type philosopher. This man is almost a cross between Homer and the Oracle of Delphi, if you're following from Greek antiquity. This man claimed to be foretelling the future by his poems. So that's why he calls him a prophet of their own. They accepted this man as a prophet. He wasn't a mere philosopher. He was an insane and perhaps demon-possessed poet who claimed to foretell the future. And he was held in high honor by the people of Crete. In fact, they paid him divine honors. But the Apostle Paul quotes him as a true witness to the character of the people of Crete. The Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, slow bellies. It's interesting that although Epimenides said this about the pagan Gentile Cretans, Paul applies it equally to the Cretan Jews. See, every people group has its peculiar vices. Every people group has its peculiar vices. We have here a witness that there were particular vices that were characteristic of the people of Crete. And yet, those vices that were characteristic of the people of Crete were adopted by the Jewish, the Cretan Jews that had moved to Crete and had gotten involved with the culture of Crete, and they became liars, evil beasts, slow bellies, just like the Gentile Cretans. They adopted the vices of Cretan culture. And this gives lie to one of the claims of the Kenists, which claim essentially that the moral quality of different people groups is as immutable as their skin color. That's what these people purvey online. But here we see that what Epimenides said about the Gentile Cretans became true also of the Cretan Jews. Well, let's look at this character of a Cretan. He says they are always liars. Always liars. That is to say, they had addicted themselves to habitual lying. They were constantly lying. It was part of their ordinary way of speaking. Everybody knew everybody was a liar in Crete, essentially. In fact, it became, the lying of the Cretans became proverbial among the Greek-speaking peoples. They would say that someone was speaking like a Cretan. And that meant he was lying. He's speaking like a Cretan. They were always liars. And this characterizes the false teachers. They're liars. They're constantly lying. It's not merely the characteristic of the people of Crete, but it's especially the characteristic of false teachers. They make their business out of lying. Lying to themselves, lying to others, deceived and deceiving others. They're evil beasts, he says. Evil beasts. Now, when it says evil beasts, it doesn't mean, really the only thing he's conveying by evil beasts is predatory animals. Predatory animals. That's what Jacob said when Joseph's brothers brought the blood-soaked garment back to Jacob. He said, "Some evil beast hath devoured him." It's a predatory animal. So he's saying these men are predatory animals. Predatory animals, willing to kill and to destroy in order to satisfy their own cravings. Anything that stands in between them and getting what they want, what they crave, is fair game. They are evil beasts. They're predatory animals. They are also, he says, slow bellies. Slow bellies. That is to say, they're lazy or idle gluttons. Lazy or idle gluttons. The word translated slow here is translated idle in 1 Timothy chapter 5, where he's talking about the younger widows here in 1 Timothy 5, verse 13. He says, "And withal they learn to be idle." That's the same word translated slow in Titus. "Withal they learn to be idle, wandering about from house to house, and not only idle, but tattlers also, and busybodies, speaking things which they ought not." That's the way the people of Crete were. They were idle. They would just go about, like it says there in 1 Timothy, from house to house. They're gossips. They're not diligently applying themselves to work. They're not applying themselves to improve themselves, to improve the things that belong to them, minding their own business and being diligent in their own business. Instead, they're idle and they're concerned with everybody else's business. And they're just going, they're more about socializing than being diligent in their own business. Similarly, we read in 2 Thessalonians, "For we hear that there are some which walk among you disorderly, not working at all, but are busybodies." They're busybodies. going from house to house, talking with, just socializing and so forth. Now, you see how that kind of culture is so advantageous to these false teachers who like to creep into houses. Because these are people who already like to visit. They spend all their time in visiting. And so along comes the false teacher. Let's sit down for a visit. And they begin to lace their conversation with their false teaching. Slow bellies or idle bellies, that is to say gluttons. Bellies, that is to say gluttons. They're called bellies because the most prominent thing about them is their belly. They live for their bellies. Their God is their belly. They are immoderate, fleshly, and carnal. They are intemperate. One profitable study that you could do, we're not going to do it tonight, but would be to look at all of these characteristics of a false teacher and stand them up against the qualifications given for eldership in this passage. And you'll see that many of the characteristics of false teachers have an answering qualification in the elders, where they're contrary one to another. Obviously, for these gluttonous people, they are intemperate. They're intemperate. But a true teacher, a true elder, is to be temperate. Well, this character that we see here of the Cretans, or Cretians, you can say it either way. I know I've been going back and forth. Cretans, Cretians. It's not merely the character of the false teachers. This is the character of the Cretans themselves. It's the people who are on that island. It's their culture. They are always liars. They are evil beasts. They're slow bellies. They're lazy, carnal, dishonest busybodies. That's how they lived. They're not given to personal discipline or to serious thought. They're like couch potatoes. They're people who just love to stuff their mouths and be entertained and to have idle talk, all to no profit. That's how they live. It sounds a lot like Americans, if you ask me. It's a couch potato culture. That's how the Cretans were. And this is the character that the cunning false teachers would exploit. They would come and they would target these people who weren't given to serious thought, who liked to be entertained, who liked to hear some new thing, some new and exciting thing. And so it is in our day. People blown about with every wind of doctrine. The next thing that comes up on the internet, the next so-called movement, the next trend that comes along, and they all get obsessed over that. And then the next year it's something else, and they're all obsessed over that. It's because they're not really given to serious thought, however much they may be puffed up with thinking they've really gotten a hold of something. The reality is they're just entertaining themselves. They're just entertaining themselves. It's couch potato culture. It's a Cretan culture. And this is the very kind of culture that the false teachers are so good at exploiting. And so we need to guard ourselves. This is also the character of the people that Titus was called to minister to. It was out of an island full of people who were always liars, evil beasts, slow bellies, that he was to find people who are blameless, a husband of one wife, faithful children, etc. All of these qualifications for eldership. These men would be one among 1,000, it seems, in such a place. But this is what Titus had to work with. And so Titus had to know his people. Titus had to know the particular weaknesses of the people that he was working with, that he might know how to defend them against the false teachers, that he might know how to answer the false teachers, and that he might train these people up to reflect the image of Jesus Christ and not be just another example of Epimenides' characterization of the people of Crete. Well, in verse 13, he tells how to deal with false teachers. He says, "Wherefore, rebuke them sharply, that they may be sound in the faith." Rebuke them sharply. He doesn't say, nudge them. He doesn't say, try to be as winsome as you can and just hint at what you're getting at with them. Instead, he says, rebuke them sharply. Don't beat around the bush with these people. You have to be direct with these sorts of people. Cut to the chase. Because these people that are so puffed up with their pride and with their false doctrine, and they're obsessed over these things, usually they don't get the hints. You have to touch it directly. You have to rebuke them sharply. Rebuke them sharply also implies not going around and around with them in their foolish arguments. Not trying to have a debate with these people, but to just rebuke them sharply. Put an end to it. To stop their mouths, as it says in verse 10. That's one of the, verse 11. That's one of the things. When you try to argue with a false teacher, you're really inviting him to open his mouth. But these people's mouths have to be shut. So it's not go in and reason with these people. It's no, get to the point with them. Rebuke them sharply. The word translated sharply is literally cuttingly. Cuttingly. Rebuke them cuttingly. And it's a word that's borrowed from the world of medicine. It's a word that's used to describe a surgical incision. A surgical incision. So rather than a broad rebuke that fails to meet its mark, Titus is to aim to rebuke with surgical precision. You see, it can be a temptation, just like it can be a temptation to go around and around with these people trying to reason with them. It can also be a temptation to just try to repulse them with just a broad rebuke that doesn't get to the point, to try to just get rid of them. But he's to rebuke them cuttingly. He's to rebuke them surgically. I've found it interesting in some of the rhetoric around some of the military operations that we've seen in recent days. This word surgical seems to have come up a lot in terms of the various operations that are being done. And what they mean by that is that they're not going in carpet bombing a place, but that they are targeting particular strategic targets and leaving everything else alone. Like a surgeon going in for the particular place of disease. That's the kind of rebuke that Titus is to give. It needs to be forceful. It needs to be cutting. It needs to get down to the root, but it also needs to be extremely well aimed. Rebuke them sharply. Rebuke them cuttingly. Rebuke them surgically. Why? This is in some ways the most amazing part of the passage. That they might be sound, that they may be sound in the faith. That they may be sound in the faith. Wait, Paul, isn't this false teachers we've been talking about? Shouldn't we just get rid of these people? No, he says rebuke them surgically, that they may be sound in the faith. The word sound could be translated healthy. Healthy. It refers to wholeness. It's connected with the surgical imagery. Rebuke them surgically that they might be healthy in the faith. That's the reason for the surgical rebuke, to address the spiritual disease and to restore them to spiritual health. That's the goal. That's the goal. The goal is not to win the argument. The goal is to win the man. The goal, first and foremost, at least in the early stage of it, is not to get rid of the man, but to win the man. To bring the man to a place of spiritual health. But though winning the man is the goal, even that has its limits. That has its limits. And so we read later in the same book, verse 10 of chapter 3, he says, "A man that is an heretic, after the first and second admonition, reject, knowing that he that is such is subverted and sinneth, being condemned of himself." A heretic after the first and second admonition, reject him. No more trying to restore him to health. He's been given over. And there comes a time when that has to be accepted about somebody. They've been given over. They've been reproved. They've been surgically rebuked. They've been dealt with, and they aren't changing. Paul says, reject him. He's subverted. He's in sin. He's condemned. It takes pastoral wisdom to know how and when to answer a fool according to his folly. That's really what we're talking about here. Answer not a fool according to his folly, lest thou be like unto him. So don't go around and around to these people, lest you become base like they are, lest you become a fool like them by trying and trying and trying to reason with someone who doesn't care to be reasoned with. He's not interested in reason. But then he says, answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own conceit. Lest he be wise in his own conceit. And so if you can win the man, if you can answer him according to his folly, such that he can be not wise in his own conceit, but corrected, and he receives correction, then you've won the man. That's the best possible outcome. That's the best possible outcome. Elsewhere we read, seest thou a man wise in his own conceits? There is more hope of a fool than of him. Just because he's a fool, just because a man's a fool and has been saying foolish things and empty talk, doesn't mean there's no hope for him. Because some fools can be won, but some fools can't. And so it takes wisdom to know when and how to answer a fool according to his folly. When a man has been dealt with, when a man has been reasoned with, when a man has been reproved the first and the second time, and he remains in his folly and in his false doctrine, we're not to answer him according to his folly anymore. we're to reject him. He's been given over. Might he return? Maybe. That's the Lord's business. There comes a point when our business is to simply put such a man out. When he can't be won, the task left to the minister or to the elder is to neutralize that man's influence within the flock. That is to say, to get rid of the wolf. Get rid of the wolf. This is a man who is not being won. He's just here to cause trouble. That's all he's going to do. He's been talked to, and he's been talked to. Get rid of him. Reject him. Get rid of the wolf. That's all that can be done. Not all false teachers are the same. It's challenging. We're not able to see men's hearts. We don't know who can be won and who can't be won until they've been tried, until they've been dealt with, until men have really come alongside them in a spirit of meekness and rebuked them cuttingly, surgically, to try to deal with them and see if they'll listen to counsel. We don't know. Some men are like arch deceivers. Their whole thing is manipulating and deceiving others. Some men are false teachers who are really under the power of one of those arch deceivers. They're under the sway of somebody else, and they're being used by like a puppet, by an arch deceiver. And there may be hope for such a one. True believers can fall into deceptions. True believers backslide. Might a false teacher, in some cases, be a true believer? Yeah, he might. We don't know the heart. This is how they're to be dealt with. And we see how the Lord might work in the midst of it. Amen.